Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Monday, April 20th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, Congress is building a path to resolution for the Department of Homeland Security, even as it opens up the next appropriation cycle. Plus, Congress is often treated like an abstract institution, but it's also a workplace with real security pressures and family realities. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of The Federal Drive. We begin with this. The Department of Homeland Security has now been in a shutdown for more than 2 months. DHS officials are warning Congress about growing backlog of contracts, canceled planning activities, and more impacts as the shutdown drags on. For the latest, Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday joins me now. Justin, thanks for being here.
Good to be with you, Terry.
What specifically is DHS saying about where it's falling behind due to the shutdown?
Yeah, it's interesting. You look across the different components. Let's start with the Coast Guard. Admiral Kevin Lunday, Commandant of the Coast Guard, testified before the House Appropriations Committee on Thursday of last week. He mentioned that the Coast Guard has over 5,000 unpaid utility bills right now. More than 100 providers have threatened to cut off electricity and water to Coast Guard stations. And then Lunday told lawmakers that the Coast Guard has a growing backlog of 18,000 merchant mariner credentials that are not being processed during the shutdown. And so the Coast Guard is really seeing some big effects on some of their normal operations, of course. You turn to Customs and Border Protection. Obviously, we know that the One Big Beautiful Bill provided a lot of funding for CBP and ICE, and so a lot of their employees have been paid throughout the shutdown. But CBP Commissioner Rodney Scott told the same House subcommittee that service contracts, are not allowed to kind of go forward to be renewed right now. And so he said that aircraft, patrol boats, patrol vehicles for CBP that need service, they're just sitting there parked. There's border surveillance equipment that requires maintenance that's offline until funding is renewed. He mentioned confidential human sources not being paid right now. So there's just a lot of those little effects across DHS that's starting to pile up here 2 months into this shutdown.
Those are pretty significant operational impacts. Of course, DHS also is responsible for cyber security. How are those kinds of impacts playing out?
Yeah, those are harder to measure, but there's certainly been some impacts. Nick Anderson, director of the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, testified last week as well. He mentioned how 40% of CISA's staff had been working through much of the shutdown until DHS recalled all of the furloughed workers last week. But CISA still can't legally carry out many non-accepted functions or non-exempt functions during the shutdown. And that really impacts an agency like CISA, where a lot of their work is kind of outreach-based, voluntary-based, and a lot of those things aren't accepted during a shutdown. Anderson was specifically asked how he feels about CISA's ability to deal with growing cyber threats to critical infrastructure, especially given the ongoing war in Iran.
Given our current situation, I'll be honest with you and tell you it is more limited than I would like. During the course of the shutdown, again, we've had approximately 40% of our staff working at CISA. A lot of those preparatory activities within the environment, a lot of the outreach that we would typically be able to do, that's simply not possible or legally allowed during the period of a shutdown. We're doing everything that we can.
That sounds pretty serious when you think about combat operations. We've also got upcoming international events here at home. What's happening with the World Cup, and how's that being affected by the DHS shutdown?
Yeah, that clock for the World Cup to start is starting to get really close. Chris Tomney, director of the Office of Homeland Security Situational Awareness up at DHS headquarters, was testifying on Wednesday of last week before the Senate Appropriations Committee. There was a lot of funding in the One Big Beautiful Bill for DHS to do some things on World Cup preparations, grants for state and local governments to deal with counter-drone issues, for instance. That was in that bill. And so they've been able to move forward. But Tommy mentioned that, there's just so much that goes into securing an event like the World Cup. And so the shutdown has certainly degraded some of that planning now that it's more than 2 months long.
It has hindered our coordination with state and locals. It has reduced our planning efforts. Without all that being said, though, let me assure this committee and the members of the public, we will have a safe, we will have a secure, it will be an enjoyable tournament, but it has had a negative impact on the planning.
We'll have to take his assertions at face value, I guess.
Yeah, it's interesting that those two statements kind of a little bit in conflict, but they're certainly they've been able to do less than they would normally have liked to have done in preparation of this big event.
Justin, you mentioned that DHS brought back their furloughed employees last week, even without a permanent funding bill. What's been the impact of that?
Well, the big deal there was, and you look to comments from Office of Management and Budget Director Russell Vogt last week, DHS was facing a situation where more and more employees were just going to look elsewhere for work if they were not going to be paid. And he said, actually last week in front of the Senate Budget Committee, that they had to make this move to pay DHS employees or else, quote, Secretary Mark Wayne Mullen would have had a complete walkout on his hands, according to Russell Vogt. And so they needed to fund people's paychecks to kind of prevent that, in the words of Vogt. Now you do have people being paid, but the big question is, how long does that last? And that's what I think everyone is wondering right now. But you do have folks going back to work. They can't do non-accepted activities still, as CISA Director Nick Anderson mentioned. That is not allowed. And so they're just having to kind of be limited, even though they're back at the office.
Well, you asked the question, how long till DHS runs out of money to pay its employees?
Yeah, the One Big Beautiful Bill provided a lot of funding for DHS, but it is not a limitless amount of money. And if you read Vogt's comments closely during that meeting last week, he said there's a specific fund within that bill that they've been able to tap into. He didn't say what it was, but basically they've been able to use that to pay these furloughed DHS employees, these other DHS employees that weren't being paid up until the last couple of weeks. TSA officers, we haven't even mentioned them. They're being paid using some of that funding too, but we don't know how long it's going to last. Vogt indicated it's certainly not forever. And so he called again on Congress to come up with some sort of solution to this shutdown so that DHS can start going back to normal operations again.
Well, that's Federal News Network's Justin Doubleday. Justin, thanks for this update.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, Congress is building a path to resolution for DHS, even as it opens up the next appropriation cycle. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. DHS remains the only federal agency operating without a finalized 2026 appropriations bill, leaving Congress to rely on an unusually intricate reconciliation process to reach an outcome. All of this is happening as lawmakers begin shaping 2027 spending plans, layering urgency onto an already stalled debate. We'll walk through the implications with WTOP's Capitol Hill correspondent, Mitchell Miller. Mitchell, thanks so much for joining me today.
You bet.
I'm starting to feel like it's Groundhog Day when I talk to you. We are still talking about DHS funding and reconciliation. So let's start there again. What is the latest on DHS funding?
Well, here we are in April, right? This is the fiscal 26 budget, just to remind people. And where we are is actually a little bit ahead of where we've been in the past. They are slowly but surely making progress. And this week is really going to be critical because the Senate has decided that it is going to go ahead with a budget resolution this week on the floor. They are bypassing the Budget Committee, although the chair of that committee, Lindsey Graham, is bringing this resolution to the floor. And what that means is they will get it to the floor and then they will have the infamous vote-a-rama to take all the amendments related to the budget resolution. The Senate hopes to get it through, and then eventually they will bounce it back to the House. Now, as we've talked about before, that is complicated because many House conservatives don't like the Senate approach. They think that they need to add more things in connection with budget reconciliation. The resolution, of course, is the first step to reconciliation, and the Senate really wants what they call a skinny bill to get through ICE and border protection so that they can move on to the overall Department of Homeland Security bill. So keep following me here, but once that happens, then the House Republicans say then they will attack the Department of Homeland Security overall and try to pass it that way. But what this means is we're looking at weeks and weeks of additional legislative activity now.
So just to make sure I'm tracking with you, this budget resolution would just fund CBP and ICE. It would get into reconciliation, and then once reconciliation is through, they would come back with a funding bill for the rest of DHS?
That is correct. And part of the complication is that many House Republicans worried about the midterm elections want to stuff more things in connection with reconciliation. And they say, look, if you're going to go all in and say Republicans only can pass this, then we have to have a bigger imprint on the reconciliation bill. So they're talking about various things like adding more health care benefits because they know that's an issue as they come up to the midterms. There's a whole host of other things that they would like to add in. Now, of course, the headache for House Speaker Mike Johnson is the more you add into reconciliation, the more likely that this is going to get into a slog. And here we are, of course, in mid-April. And if you slog your way through May when there is actually a break, then before you know it, you can be getting into late May all the way to Memorial Day weekend. And there's just really concern that they can't really blow past any more deadlines at this point. And in fact, President Trump has set a June 1st deadline to say, look, we've got to get all of this done, including Homeland Security, by June 1st. So this is going to be a very interesting period here in Congress.
One of the June 1st deadlines that the president also established was getting the Save America voting law passed. Is that now part of reconciliation? Is that another domino that falls somewhere else?
Well, that's a great point because a lot of Republicans, that's another one of these things that they want to add into reconciliation. They want to have something in connection with the SAVE Act. The problem is if you get it passed in the House, then it has to go back to the Senate again if you make that kind of a change. And the Senate Democrats have indicated they will not allow that to pass. So I think that might be a domino that might fall to the side, much as that would really anger a lot of House Republicans because they feel, and Senate Republicans, many of them, who want to see that get in there. But there is, at some point, you have to kind of finish adding all of these things, as you know, and just come up with something that everybody can agree to.
So at the bottom of that pile of actions is still DHS funding. They are still not funded, despite the president's executive orders to pay some people out of adjacent funds. Could we be looking at July before the Department of Homeland Security's miscellaneous agencies actually get 2026 appropriations?
Well, you know, it could actually happen if they get tripped up on some of these issues that we just touched on, and that would really cause some problems. And in fact, last week there were a lot of warnings from various agency officials saying, look, you can't just say that DHS is eventually going to be funded. As we know, the administration has used money from the so-called Big Beautiful Bill from last year to try to let it limp along. But we had warnings last week, for example, from ICE, from Border Protection, saying they need this funding moving forward. There was warnings in connection with the fact that the World Cup is going to be taking place later this year, and there are a whole host, of course, of security issues that have to be taken care of. And lawmakers were warned last year that if they don't get the funding for this, a lot of these things are going to fall apart. So really, even though it's kind of been in the background a lot of this time, it's really coming to a head now.
I'm speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, I don't feel like we've resolved the 2026 issue, but I want to move to 2027 because that is literally right around the fiscal corner. Russ Vought testified on the Hill last week. Some House appropriations bills are coming out. What are you hearing about the progress and the schedule for 27 appropriations?
Right. So they better get going on 2027, right? And Russ Vought did come to the Hill. He did not want to talk about the exact amount of money that the White House was going to ask lawmakers for in connection with additional funding for the war with Iran. But we do know some details of a variety of pieces of legislation that are now being rolled out. For example, the Military Construction and Veterans Affairs legislation, appropriations in the House has released a discretionary spending of about $157 billion. That's a 3% increase. Some of the highlights is that it would fully fund veterans' health care programs and benefits, maintain funding for mental health. It would also include billions of dollars for capital improvements to VA medical facilities. On the flip side, there are reductions proposed for financial services and general government appropriations. These would be cut by close to $1 billion or just under 4%. And some of the highlights there, or lowlights in the view of some people, perhaps federal employees, is that the administration proposes to continue to shrink the size of the federal workforce to what it calls pre-COVID Biden levels. So you can look for, again, more domestic cuts, at least proposed by the administration. We'll have to see what Congress does. And they are going to also be identifying those federal office spaces to lower costs, what they say is needed to cut waste, fraud, and abuse. So you're going to see in a different way some of the continuation that we saw of things related to DOGE, although not quite as formalized. And then overall, the big picture is, of course, we're hearing a lot of talk from members of Congress, especially on the Republican side, since they control everything, that they are going to get back to regular order, and we are going to have all these appropriations bills neatly lined up and passed, a dozen of them in time for the start of the next fiscal year. However, I am very skeptical that is going to happen, since that has literally not happened in 30 years. So I think we will see some progress in the coming weeks and months, but don't look for them to meet that deadline come October 1st.
Mitchell, I think my magic 8-ball says signs point to no.
No question.
Especially since they will all want to get out of town before the election in November.
Exactly.
There is one other topic that I want to raise, and that is around war powers and authorization of continuing operations in Iran. Number of votes have made it to the floor in both chambers. Nothing has passed yet. You mentioned that Mr. Vought didn't talk about supplemental funding there. Is there a threshold or a marker on the calendar that might cause lawmakers to change their minds on this issue?
There actually is, and it is essentially the end of this month, right around April 28th. We're going to hit the 60-day point of the war with Iran unless something very different happens in the coming weeks. And that is the marker that many Republicans who up until this point have firmly been behind the president have opened the door and said, maybe we ought to take another look at where we are with the war. So last week we had another war powers resolution that fell in the Senate, and Democrats, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer has said he will continue to bring up these resolutions until something changes. But what will likely change once we hit that point at the end of this month is that some GOP lawmakers will say, okay, we actually do need to go on the record and say, are we going to continue this? Because that is really a requirement of Congress. Now, Democrats have been making the argument that Congress should have weighed in a long time earlier, but I think that is where we're probably going to see some kind of change. If the war is continuing and we don't see one of these extensions of a ceasefire, and we'll have to, of course, see what happens with the Strait of Hormuz and all of the things that are going along with the war. So we will be seeing something, I think, change by the end of this month.
I've been speaking with Mitchell Miller. He's Capitol Hill correspondent for WTOP. Mitchell, really appreciate your insight. There's so much going on.
Sure thing.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, the rising cost of security is reshaping who can run for federal office and how campaigns operate. But first, Congress is often treated like an abstract institution. But it's also a workplace with real security pressures and family realities. You're listening to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Behind the scenes on Capitol Hill, concerns about personal safety, logistics, and family well-being shape how members and staff experience the job day to day. We'll take a practical look at how those very human factors affect focus, capacity, and the ability to do sustained legislative work. Danielle Stewart from the Popbox Foundation joins me. Danielle, it's great to have you. Welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Terry.
You recently testified before Congress on initiatives to help future-proof Congress. Before we get into the future, though, I want to look at where Congress actually operates today. And from your vantage point, where does Congress most visibly struggle to keep up with the pace and the complexity of the work it's expected to do?
Yeah, that's a great question, Terry. So in the public testimony that I submitted to the House Appropriations Committee, I focused on three main pillars. My colleagues also submitted testimony focused on tech in Congress, which is a huge piece of what Popbox Foundation works on. It's ensuring that legislatures and the legislative branch here in the United States are able to keep pace with the rapid growth of technology. And so what that means is making sure that Congress has the tools available to operate at an efficient and effective level, making sure that they are able to utilize the best and the brightest to make sure that they are serving the American people effectively and they are keeping pace with the private sector and what other companies and the American people are using in their daily lives. And so from the foundation standpoint, that means a lot of AI adoption and deployment. That also means making sure that they are adequately supporting their workforce to make sure that members and staff have the best tools and the best support within the legislative branch to do their jobs effectively and efficiently. And so our testimony focused on constituent services, tech, which I mentioned, and then my testimony focused on the buckets that we like to call the life in Congress piece. And so that's focused on, like I said, workforce, safety, and modernization within the halls of Congress.
It's a really complex suite of challenges facing the legislative branch. You use the term future-proofing to describe this suite of concerns. Who in the legislative branch is responsible for taking these up and thinking long-term to build new structures that really do help Congress address these in the future?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I think that in terms of a leadership perspective, this is something that should be important to everybody that's working in the legislative branch. It should be important to the staff and the members, should be important to the chief administrative officer, to House leadership, Senate leadership, Senate Sergeant at Arms on the Senate side. And this is something that, we've seen over the last 7 or 8 years since the start of the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress in the 116th Congress, which was a bipartisan effort. I was a staffer on that committee. This is something that members can care about and implement in their own offices. This is something that staff can talk about and talk to their bosses about. We've talked to so many offices who are working on doing AI training on their own, working on putting together different requirements and tools and handbooks and making sure that it's part of their review system, that they are adopting these tools and utilizing this technology in their workflow. That's a management requirement. And that's something that, like I said, comes from the top. And that's incredibly important. So I think that this is a branch-wide effort, and it should continue to be that way.
I'm speaking with Danielle Stewart. She's advisor for congressional initiatives at the Popbox Foundation. Danielle, let's drill into your testimony, specifically those life in Congress issues. You point to two really important personal concerns. One is security, and one is family support. Tell us more about those, what you're hearing.
Yeah, so these requests come from speaking with congressional staff and members on what their needs are and where they see improvements can be made within the legislative branch. And a lot of this also comes from my personal experience as a longtime Hill staffer. So from the security perspective, members and their staff are facing an increasingly complex threat environment. The DC offices in Washington, DC, it's a congressional campus. Everyone's housed in, a number of just a couple of buildings. Everyone goes through security to go into those buildings. There's a robust Capitol Police presence, and you feel pretty contained within those buildings. At the district level, district offices do not have that they're not at parity in terms of the security levels. Some district offices are in federal buildings. Some district offices are in strip malls. And so the security on the difference in security for those offices can be very stark. And as someone who has set up freshman member offices before, there is a huge gap and a huge need, especially in those first couple of months when you're hiring staff, you're trying to get your office set up. You may not have a phone line set up, depending on if you moved into a new office space where there wasn't an existing tenant. You might not have Wi-Fi. You certainly don't have panic buttons set up if someone were to come into the office. And so there's a huge disparity in what is provided and really what is needed for these members and their staff at the district level. And in DC, the majority of folks who are answering the phones in DC offices and congressional offices are front office staff and interns. And same with folks when they're coming in and out of the office. The first person you're going to see when you walk into a congressional office is a staff assistant or an intern usually. There is currently no comprehensive security training that is required for congressional staff. There is cybersecurity training and there's ethics training, both are which incredibly important and they should continue happening. But there's no training on how to handle folks who might come into the office and seem threatening or who actually threaten you in person. There's no training on how to handle a protest. There's no training on how to handle a phone call if someone calls and threatens you or your boss or says, I know where the member is going to be tomorrow. Outside of a handbook, which you can certainly consult Capitol Police and consult House leadership and other members of Congress, there's no standardized training requirement. And so talking with members and talking with staff, this is a huge need. And this is something that I think, especially for front office staff, equipping staff and members and interns, especially with the tools they need to make sure that they feel safe at work, know how to handle an intense situation, know how to de-escalate if someone comes into the office and is unruly or is being threatening or disruptive. These are really important tools that the House should be providing, and the Senate as well, that Congress in general should be providing its members and its staff.
And what about the concerns of family orientation?
Yeah, so this is something that came directly from member offices who were newly elected members. And like I said, this is having set up a couple of freshman offices. I've seen this firsthand. The first week in Congress is so exciting, especially that swearing in day. A lot of offices will have open houses, and so they'll have supportive constituents, families, friends come to DC, come to see their new office, come to watch the swearing in from the office on the floor. It's so exciting. This is something that members and their families and their networks have worked so hard to be able to accomplish, to be able to come to DC and support their communities. But there's currently nothing in place for the families and the children of those members who are starting out on this new life event, right? A lot of these members are traveling very long distances weekly. They are away from their families. The trend to move your families to Washington, D.C. to live here while you're in session has changed dramatically over the last 30 years. And so most members keep their families at home in the district. And so that means long nights, long weeks away from your family. And especially for families with young children, that's a huge change to have a mom or a dad gone when you're used to having them home. And so being able to have something specific for the families during those first couple of days, during that swearing in day specifically, that is really welcoming, that gives them an opportunity to meet other families, for spouses to go somewhere where there's a helpful couple of booths where they can speak with members of the Capitol Police, the kids can meet the police officers so they don't feel as intimidated coming to DC and going through security. They can talk to people from the Library of Congress and learn about some of the cool resources that the library has and things that the kids can look forward to doing when they come to visit their parents. One of the things that I did in my first year with Pop Vox Foundation was put together a children's book for children of members of Congress. It's called Welcome to Washington. We dropped it off at freshman member offices for that swearing in day at the start of this current Congress. It's got fun facts about DC. It's got a scavenger hunt in the Capitol, and it's got like a fun autograph page so kids can look forward to meeting other members or meeting folks here in DC that they're excited about. Just making sure that members and their families are welcomed and that they have resources to feel supported here. I think this year especially, we've seen a record number of retirements in the House specifically. And I think family structure and family needs really play into that. So making sure that when families start this new chapter, there are resources for the whole family and not just for the member in their job.
Danielle, I don't want to brush by those. Those are really significant issues, and not addressing them can really have an impact on a member's effectiveness if they're distracted by security concerns or distracted about their family's safety or integration. They may not bring their full mental focus to the job. What are you hearing from Congress in terms of taking on these issues and thinking about addressing them?
Yeah. So, in the last year, especially following a lot of violence last summer against elected officials at the state level too, not just at the federal level, there's been some big changes on the security front in terms of the funding that's available for members and what they can use their representational allowance, which is the money that they're able to use for their congressional office for expenses and salaries, what they're able to use that money for. And so that was a huge improvement in letting them use that money for personal security at events. There's currently a residential security program that exists. There's a certain amount of money that members are allotted. They can work with the House Sergeant at Arms, local police and Capitol Police to install security measures at their homes. This is a wonderful program, but as of maybe last summer, I think only a little over 150 folks had really taken advantage of it. And so there's a huge discrepancy in terms of what's available and making sure that members are actually taking advantage of these security measures to keep them and their families safe, and their staff too.
Why is this the right time to be thinking about these initiatives in terms of future-proofing Congress?
I think it's always the right time to be thinking about these things. I think that making sure, especially as we are heading into campaign year, there will be a new batch of members coming in January. A lot of these members will be probably much tech savvier than Congress has passed, given the fact that campaigns are using a lot of these tools like AI in their daily workflow, and a lot of members may not be. And so making sure that these improvements are being made year over year to welcome a new batch of members, to start the legislative branch and the Congress off on the right foot, and to prioritize modernization. Modernization and innovation is not a one and done situation. It is something that is ongoing and needs to be prioritized. And like I said, this is not just a top down priority, something that only leadership or the CAO can be working on. It's certainly critical that they are prioritizing it, but members and staff also have the capability to care about these things and to implement them in their daily offices.
I've been speaking with Danielle Stewart. She's advisor for congressional initiatives at the Pop Vox Foundation. Danielle, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks, Terry.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, the rising cost of security is reshaping who can run for federal office and how campaigns operate. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Running for federal office now comes with security costs that were once rare, and those costs are rising fast. A new analysis looks at how the growing need for personal and digital security is changing who can realistically run for office and how campaigns operate behind the scenes. We'll talk through what that shift means for access, participation, and the health of democratic institutions with Justin Sherman of the Public Service Alliance. Justin, it is great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
You've got a new report out at Public Service Alliance on the cost to run for office. When you think about the data that you found and what it takes to run for federal office today, what feels most out of alignment with how our democratic system is supposed to function?
It's out of alignment, among other reasons, because it costs so much to ensure you can run safely. And that's really the alarming big point here, right? I mean, at PSA, we're a nonpartisan organization. We focus both on research of this issue space as well as I know you've covered on this program before, providing discounted security and privacy and other tools to public servants across the country who need them. And so in looking at this last decade of federal campaign and committee spending data, what we see is really an unsustainable over 5 times increase just in the last decade in the amount of money that these various groups have to spend on bulletproof vests, on bodyguards, on event security, on home alarm systems. And so to get to the crux of your question, it's really concerning that in order to run for public office for an American who wants to serve their community, they have to not only think about, the dollars to buy the flyers and do the get out the vote events and send around the pins in the neighborhood, but also about what they need to do to make sure they don't get attacked, or what happens if I get a death threat, or how do I protect my home from someone who doxes me. And so we'll dig more into the numbers, but that's really the concerning top line of this study. And I think it is not, it's certainly not a good indication of where we are right now vis-a-vis public servants.
Thank you for the overall message here. And let's dig into the numbers. You looked at the last 5 election cycles. So tell us about the trajectory of the spending and how you've seen changes over that time frame.
Sure. So campaigns and committees and other organizations are required to, under federal law, submit a wide range of expense receipts and other information to the FEC, the Federal Election Commission. And so, as you noted, we went back through at the time of the report's authoring what were the last 5 campaign cycles. So these are 2015-16, 2017-18, 2019-20, 2021-22, and 2023 to 2024. The FEC, we're recording this middle of April, the FEC now has just been starting to release the data from 2025 to 2026. So that's actually something we will be taking a look at and publishing yet more information on that. But I'll just say we looked at this last 10 years of data and really zeroed in on, let's look across these many, gazillions of expenses, filter down to those focused on security. And then within that, can we tabulate across the years what was spent in terms of the temporal changes? And then can we tabulate across categories? So looking at things like home security upgrades, looking at digital security spending, right? Because so many threats, of course, are in the digital sphere. So some top line numbers, we found that at least $104 million in that time period went towards security across these campaigns and committees. I say at least because this is a conservative number, right? Not every expense is explicitly listed as security. Sometimes, it could be put under office expenses or building fees, right? And not labeled as security. Or we went through thousands and thousands and thousands of manually of expenditures, but you could go through even more if you add in words that are about security, but don't use the word security, right? So all to say, it's at least this number. We think the actual is much higher. So 104 million. I'll give you a couple other stats up front. The increase I mentioned, the spending in the 2023 to 2024 cycle on security, more than 5 times what it was in 2015 to 2016. So we really see a huge spike. And then, as I mentioned, a lot of that spike is reflected in these different sub areas. So event security spending continues to go up overall. Security on digital issues continues to go up. And then perhaps we'll dig more into this one because I think it's one of the most disturbing, is that home-related security spending through campaigns and committees continues to rise as well.
Justin, where does the money come from to pay for those expenses? Is it coming from campaign coffers? Is it coming from congressional offices? From the candidate's own personal checking account?
It's a really great question. In this case, we focus specifically on expenditures that campaigns and committees make and report to the FEC. So this does not include, which is really important, and I'm glad you underscored this, it does not include something that a sitting member of Congress gets as a result of having U.S. Capitol Police resources, right? Not every member, as we know, and as you've certainly talked about on other episodes, not every member obviously gets a personal detail, but they do have access to threat monitoring, to building security, things of that sort, right? This does not include, which is way higher of an expense, Secret Service protection provided to presidential and vice presidential candidates at that point in the campaign when that gets activated, which is something that the taxpayer, rightfully so, but that the taxpayer, that the federal government pays for, not the campaign. So again, there are categories that aren't covered here. You could also have candidates and individuals that spend money on home security in ways that are not reported here. I'm not a campaign finance law expert, but certainly those we consulted for this study, and others have written about this, right? It kind of varies. The guidance has changed a bit, which is good, that campaigns and candidates can spend more money on security. This is not something captured here, but also members of Congress can allocate more of their office funds towards security. In the last couple of years, a lot don't use it, which is sort of an interesting side point. But all to say, so it doesn't include those several categories. It's really focused on, as mentioned, if you're fundraising for a campaign, for a committee, you're factoring in your head, or perhaps you aren't, and you end up spending a lot on it later, that you need to be spending this money on physical and digital security.
I'm speaking with Justin Sherman. He's Vice President of the Security Project at the Public Service Alliance. Justin, what does this tell us then about the people who can afford to run for office?
It's highly troubling because it creates yet another barrier to entry to public service, right? Other groups, we cite, for example, a study done by the Vote Mama Foundation, which does excellent work on this topic, among many others, that looked at this specifically with a lens towards parents and caregivers and women. Obviously, we know when it comes to violence and doxing and violent threats in general, that women are at disproportionate risk, women of color are at disproportionate risk, people of color are at disproportionate risk, et cetera. And so all to say, it's already varied who can run for office, how much it takes to do so. There's the class dynamic that cuts across demographics of, if you're wealthier, of course, you can fund your own campaign and so on. And so the fact that for a candidate, it might cost an extra, whether it's 10 grand or 100 grand or 500 grand for the high spenders to cover your security to run, that's really concerning, right? That's going to be prohibitive for some people. And even if it's not prohibitive, it means rather than spending those campaign or committee dollars on things like get out the vote events or bipartisan meetings with future constituents or, policy or polling work, it's instead going towards mitigating risks of violence.
Beyond those really important limitations, what does this increased focus on personal security mean for how events are conducted, how campaigns are conducted?
I'd say two things. So one is it reflects what we've seen many policymakers, public servants, elected officials say in polling and surveys. I'm thinking of Princeton University's Bridging Divides initiative and work with other partners who have looked at this, not just at the federal level, but other levels, right? Where lots of people trying to run for office or commit a life to public service are worried about voicing certain policy views that are contentious, or maybe they pull back more from public events. They do fewer events. The events are less open. You have to RSVP ahead of time. You need to go through 5 metal detectors to get in there, right? I mean, it just creates a different atmosphere than having, we think of the traditional sort of, stump on a log, stand up and talk on the street corner, right? If we think back to, older days of politics, that's not really something a lot of folks feel comfortable doing these days. So it kind of creates this and contributes to, I think, this pullback effect in how our public servants are willing to engage, which, we haven't studied this in detail, but I'm sure also then contributes in some insidious ways to the threat landscape, right? Folks feel like it's harder to access politicians or they're more removed from public life. The second thing I want to highlight, I mentioned earlier, which is a huge spike in home-related security spending. We detected, again, I doubt in practice there was nothing spent on this, but at least in our data, we found 0 expenditures in 2015 to 2016 that were marked as home security. That total grows quickly towards $1 million as you get closer to to the present. And so in some cases that was, CCTV cameras. In other cases, that's physical upgrades. So hardening windows, one can imagine that probably means bulletproof glass. I mean, things that are horrifying, right? Not only just as Americans who want to see people serve in public without fear, but also knowing that people's children are there, right? And we've seen lots of acts of violence where kids are home, parents are home, grandparents are home. And so all to say that's really the second thing. And I think that if we're looking at ways really capable, honest, hardworking Americans are going to be deterred from public service and running for office, it's going to be threatening your kids and your family. And so that's really another, again, lots of others have written on this problem as well. And that was something concerning we found in this campaign spending data.
Justin, there's one more complexity that I want to ask you about as you think about event security, home security, as you just mentioned. This security infrastructure oftentimes draws on services that intersect with federal regulation, with law enforcement, with public-private coordination. So what kind of demand is this putting on, say, the local police departments or other kinds of private security services?
It's definitely demands there, as you're noting, right? I mean, anecdotally, there are a number of cases in the spending data where folks hired really prominent, large national companies. I mean, companies many people would immediately recognize on TV or by name to do some aspect of their security. There were other times where, kind of to your question, I looked up a few anecdotally, a local company or in many cases actually hiring, off-duty police officers, of course, for security, which many businesses and others also do, right? In nightclubs and others in day-to-day life. But that was a real source of spending too. And so I think it contributes to, in some ways, those are opportunities for those businesses. And there's this market that, of course, raises questions, like we said, about what are the costs? Are these services, which is something at PSA we talk about a lot, are these services vetted, right? Because there are lots of great companies and services out there providing important security offerings. There are others out there that are way overpriced or don't actually deliver what the delta between what they say they do and what they actually do is huge. And so that's concerning. And the last thing is what we don't know, it's not captured in this data. It's something we're interested in studying more, is what you said. What's the cost to the taxpayer because of the local, which is maybe what you were getting at, the local response, right? When you have doxing and swatting, as I've written about before, that is police now not responding to something else, right? I mean, we all know that no government organization on earth has unlimited resources. So, the idea that huge increases in these threats or online doxing and so on, a lot of which don't materialize, and this is part of the problem, don't materialize into real violence. And so on the one hand, you have local law enforcement chasing all these leads and chasing all these ends, again, pulling time from other public safety priorities. At the same time, some of them do flip into real world violence, right? We saw the horrific murder of Melissa Hortman and her husband and the shooting of 2 others last year. And the individual who allegedly did that had a list where he wrote down the names of the data brokers, the people search websites he had used to look up and research his targets. So, it's really complicated. All to say, it's not numbers we captured in this report per se, but I think, as you note, the strain we're seeing on the federal campaign and committee system for security is reflective of other strains on local public servants, local law enforcement, others who are trying to, keep their communities safe.
This is really sobering data, and it has big implications about the future of elections and who can run and, as we say, who can represent their constituencies. We're talking here only at the federal level, but our understanding is the same sorts of patterns are playing out in state and local elections. As you look forward, what do you see on the horizon? Is there hope for change here? What would need to be put into effect from a policy perspective to better equalize, the opportunities?
2 buckets. The first is short term, what we really need to do urgently, which is, you mentioned equalize, right? We want to make sure that anyone who wants to run for office, this doesn't become prohibitive and disproportionate or disproportionately prohibitive, right? We don't want, if you are lower income and want to run for office, well, good luck, because here's yet another expense you have to deal with, right? Or to say nothing of, we don't want writ large anyone running for office, no matter where they are on the political spectrum, to have to deal with violence and threats to their kids as part of that, and deal with the costs as part of that. So to tackle that, which we talk about, we cite to great work from Vote Mama Foundation and National Council of State Legislators and others that have written about this. A lot of states are modifying or looking to modify their campaign and committee laws to ensure that certain funds can be spent on security. Sometimes that's prohibited by ethics, by other barriers. So making sure that that's possible is really big. So that's, I think, the biggest short-term thing to unlock, let's say, if those funds are sitting there in the campaign or committee account, we want to make sure that that can actually be put towards a death threat or a bodyguard if that's something that's needed for that person to run. Longer term, though, this is obviously not sustainable, right? We don't want to have this be accepted as status quo that, make sure you set aside your $5 million for your to protect your kids from death threats, right? So I'll just say that gets into broader solutions around, lowering the temperature and passing, which we've written about in previous work, passing better privacy laws to, rather than putting the cost onto local law enforcement and to public servants, we stop doxing at the source by limiting personal data and particularly home address data. So there are other structural solutions we talk about in the report, but I think, A, drawing attention to this, especially the nexus to home and kids, and B, as we noted, passing and reforming some of these campaign and committee laws is sort of a near term. States are already doing it or in the process of looking at it literally right now. So if we're talking next 6 to 12 months, that's a big potential opportunity area.
Justin Sherman is Vice President of the Security Project at the Public Service Alliance. Justin, thank you so much for joining me and bringing this data to our attention.
Thanks very much for having me.
We'll post this interview and a link to the report at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Listen to the Federal Drive on your schedule. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The Forest Service is defending its plan to relocate its headquarters out west and shutter most of its research facilities as part of a major agency reorganization. The agency is looking to move its headquarters to Salt Lake City, Utah, and close all of its regional offices. The agency is looking to move its headquarters to Salt Lake City, Utah, and close all of its regional offices. The agency is making its case to Congress, but says it will proceed with these plans with or without approval from lawmakers. Federal News Network's Jory Heckman joins me with more details. Jory, thanks for being here.
Hey, Terry. Great to be here.
I feel like we've been down the Forest Service reorganization path before. What are they looking to do with this round?
Right. So what they are looking to do is that they're looking to move their headquarters, first of all, to Salt Lake City, Utah, out west. It's currently based in Washington, D.C., like many other facilities. And it would shut down the vast majority of its research facilities, about 57 of the 77 that they have in place. And it would shut down all 9 of its regional offices. The future model that the Forest Service would be moving toward would be a lot more reliant on the state agencies that they already partner with, and that some of these facilities actually would be repurposed under this new model, but this is what they're looking at this point. Forest Service Chief Tom Schultz did tell members of the House Appropriations Committee last week that all told, about 500 employees would have to relocate under this headquarters reorganization plan, which is only about 1.5% of the agency's total workforce.
The intent is not to push anybody out the door. The intent really is to be thoughtful about how we do this.
Anytime there's a reorganization like this, the unions tend to have something to say. What have you heard there?
What we've heard from the National Federation of Federal Employees, which represents Forest Service employees, is that the relocation is really going to impact several thousand employees, that this is going to be a massive change for these employees. In a lot of cases, they're being asked to pick up and leave, move to places that are multiple states away, multiple hours away from where they currently work and reside. What we've seen in the past with Agriculture Department reorganizations is that more often than not, these employees choose to quit rather than relocate. We saw that in the first Trump administration when the Agriculture Department moved some of its employees out to Kansas City. That this is something that is currently being talked about as USDA is looking to move about half of its headquarters employees to 5 hubs across the country, one of them being Salt Lake City. And NEFI is convinced that rather than see most employees relocate, they're going to choose to leave the agency.
Is that part of the goal here with the Forest Service relocation, to reduce headcount?
So Schultz told lawmakers that the goal is not to further shrink the workforce beyond its current levels. The Forest Service did see multiple thousand employees leave through the deferred resignation program that we saw last year, and it's got the workforce that it needs to continue to meet the mission here, but they're obviously trying to move them to other parts of the country. And Schultz was explicit here. He did tell lawmakers that the goal is not to RIF anyone or to do any kind of layoffs. One other thing that's worth bringing up here is that, of course, in addition to the reorganization plan, there's the 2027 budget request. And as part of that budget request, it would zero out research and development for the Forest Service. This is something else that they believe that the states can pick up as far as capacity. And what this would mean is that this would eliminate about 800 of the Forest Service's more than 1,000 research scientist positions.
What sort of reception did this get from lawmakers during the testimony?
Some mixed reviews for sure. There was some remarks from Congressman Ryan Zinke, Republican from Montana. If the name's familiar, that's because he is the former Interior Secretary under the first Trump administration. Under his tenure, he actually moved the Bureau of Land Management's headquarters from D.C. to Grand Junction, Colorado. So he's been down this road before, and he says that this relocation makes sense.
When you take your personnel and you bring them out west, the schools are better. The cost of living is better. The opportunity to have a house is better. And you're closer to where the actual forests are.
So that's an interesting perspective. Were there other opinions?
Well, Democrats on the committee, as you might expect, were a little cautious about this plan. We heard from the ranking member of the subcommittee, Shelley Pingree, Democrat of Maine. She says that lawmakers have been left in the dark about details of this reorganization. She says that lawmakers are finding out about this the same way that the rest of us are, on the website of the Forest Service, on the website of USDA. And for them being the appropriators in Congress who are writing the appropriations bills that will allow this to move forward or not, they're concerned that they're not getting the information they need to have an informed opinion about this.
And what was the Forest Service response to that?
Well, this did get to a point where the subcommittee chairman did pointedly ask whether the Forest Service is of the opinion of whether they need Congress to sign off on this or not. And Schultz did say that the Office of General Counsel has considered that question, and they are of the opinion that the USDA secretary can move forward with this reorganization with or without Congress's blessing.
Well, reorganization is a huge step, but are there other big changes that might be in store for the Forest Service ahead?
There is actually. One other key element of the 2027 budget request is that the Trump administration, once again, is trying to merge all of the wildland fire fighting capabilities of both the Forest Service and the Interior Department. If this sounds familiar, this is because the Trump administration tried this last year, and Congress ultimately wasn't on board with it. They passed a spending bill that still separately funded these firefighting capabilities at both of these departments. And the chairman of the subcommittee, Mike Simpson, said that this is something that Congress does need more information on. There was an agreement in the 2026 spending bill that directs USDA and Interior to find a contractor to do a comprehensive study, see the pros and cons of this plan. And that work is underway. This is something that is being contracted out now, still in the early stages of that. But once a vendor has been selected, Schultz said this is going to take about 6 months to complete. To which Simpson said that he's not sure that lawmakers will have enough time to include this reorganization as part of the 2027 budget if they really are going to get this report sometime in the fall.
In my view, anyway, it would be kind of stupid to combine the forest services in our the wildfire fighting in our bill without having the study completed. Otherwise, why do the damn study?
A lot of people are worried about fire season this year with the absence of snowpack in the West. Could be an interesting time to test the theory.
Yeah, but one thing to point out is that the Forest Service did say that they are going to wait until the wildfire season is over before they do any of these changes, really being conscious of the idea that they don't want any moves to disrupt the firefighting capabilities that are in place.
That's Federal News Network's Jory Heckman. Jory, thanks for keeping us up to date on this.
Thanks, Terry.
You can find his full story at federalnewsnetwork.com. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.